My friends, what we are witnessing right now in the Middle East is not simply another clash or headline about conflict. No, it is the eruption of decades of contradictions, power plays, and economic pressures finally boiling over. When Yemen captured two Israeli pilots, the world's media rushed to frame it as a sudden shock, something Israel didn't see coming. But let's be clear, this moment didn't appear out of nowhere. It is the inevitable outcome of long standing dynamics ignored by those in power. Military dominance without legitimacy is a temporary illusion. True power comes from resilience and purpose. This truth has echoed throughout human history, but it becomes most visible when the powerful are caught off guard by those they once dismissed as weak or insignificant. Nations invest billions into armies, into weapons, into intelligence networks that promise security and control. They believe that by possessing the most advanced technology and the most formidable arsenal, they can dictate the terms of reality itself. But what they fail to grasp is that force, by its nature, cannot generate legitimacy. It can impose order temporarily, yes, but it cannot command loyalty, respect, or the moral authority needed to sustain power over time. When Israel failed to foresee the boldness of Yemen's resistance, it wasn't because their satellites malfunctioned or their intelligence failed. It was because they underestimated the human spirit that emerges when people fight not for conquest, but for survival and dignity. History teaches us this pattern over and over again. Empires rise not just through strength, but through a belief system that justifies their dominance. And they fall the moment that belief erodes. Military power, no matter how immense, cannot survive when it loses the moral ground that legitimizes it. The Romans discovered it when their conquests stretched beyond what their citizens could believe in. The British Empire realized it when its colonies stopped accepting the myth of civilized rule. The United States has faced it in countless wars where superior firepower achieved victories on paper, but lost hearts and minds in reality. And now Israel finds itself confronting the same contradiction that no wall, no drone, no F-35 can outlast a movement rooted in endurance and belief. Legitimacy is the invisible thread that binds people to authority. It is what makes citizens obey laws, soldiers follow orders, and nations function beyond coercion. When that thread breaks, all that remains is naked power, and naked power is fragile. It creates fear, not trust, submission, not cooperation. The moment people cease to believe that a state's authority is just or rightful, every display of force begins to erode its own foundation. The more you use violence to maintain control, the more that control slips away. The captured Israeli pilots symbolize this reversal. For decades, Israel has projected an image of absolute command. The region's unmatched military, shielded by Western backing and technological supremacy, yet Yemen, with far fewer resources, turned that illusion on its head. They reminded the world that legitimacy can empower the weak in ways weapons never can. Resilience, on the other hand, cannot be purchased, built in laboratories, or launched from air bases. It is cultivated through struggle, through collective experience, through the shared understanding of injustice. The Yemeni people, after years of war and deprivation, have developed a form of strength that military strategists cannot quantify. Their endurance has become their weapon. They have been bombed, blockaded, starved, and still they fight. That kind of resilience comes not from a desire to dominate, but from the necessity to survive, and survival, when sustained over years, becomes purpose. That purpose transforms ordinary individuals into symbols, into forces of history that defy the calculations of empires. True power, therefore, resides not in who can destroy, but in who can endure. A state that commands fear may appear powerful, but it is brittle. A people who command moral conviction, however, become unbreakable. Israel's strategy, like that of many dominant powers, has been to use overwhelming force to maintain deterrence, to ensure that no adversary dares to challenge it. But deterrence fails when an opponent no longer fears death, when they no longer measure victory in the same terms. Yemen's resistance does not rely on traditional military victory. It relies on the symbolic impact of defiance itself. Every captured pilot, every intercepted missile, every sign of vulnerability within Israel's iron shield becomes a moral victory that strengthens the narrative of resistance. That narrative spreads faster than any weapon can destroy it. Legitimacy also flows from perception. A government or military that acts outside the moral boundaries accepted by its people or by the global community loses credibility when images of destruction, of civilian suffering, of disproportionate retaliation spread across the world. They shift the moral equation. Those who were once seen as protectors become aggressors. Those labeled as insurgents become freedom fighters in the eyes of the masses. Power that depends on domination cannot survive the collapse of its narrative. The illusion fades the moment people stop believing it. The capture of two pilots might seem small in tactical terms, but symbolically, it shattered the illusion that Israel's military superiority was absolute. It showed that the myth of invulnerability could be punctured by willpower and persistence. Resilience and purpose have always been the equalizers of history. They have allowed the colonized to outlast colonizers, the oppressed to outlive oppressors. They do not operate on timelines of military campaigns. They operate on the slow, enduring rhythm of belief. Every generation that inherits struggle also inherits purpose, and purpose, unlike power, cannot be bombed out of existence. This is why movements grounded in legitimacy and collective pain have such staying power. They draw their energy from what the powerful cannot understand, the idea that freedom, dignity, and justice are worth more than safety under subjugation. The more external powers attempt to crush them, the stronger that inner conviction becomes. The world has seen it in Vietnam, in Algeria, in South Africa, and now again in Yemen. Power divorced from legitimacy becomes paranoia. It must constantly prove itself, constantly demonstrate dominance to silence doubt. It becomes obsessed with control, surveillance, and suppression until it begins consuming itself. Every new conflict becomes a desperate attempt to reassert the myth that power alone can sustain authority. But the more it fights, the more it exposes its weakness. True power does not need to be performed. It exists quietly, sustained by the consent and belief of the people. When that belief disappears, tanks and bombs only accelerate decline. The moment Israel's enemies stopped fearing its strength, its dominance began to lose meaning. And when Yemen, against all odds, stood up and defied that power, it revealed that military dominance without moral foundation is nothing more than a temporary illusion, waiting to be exposed by the resilience of those who refuse to submit. You cannot suppress or occupy people indefinitely. Eventually, the oppressed redefine the terms of engagement. History has demonstrated this pattern time and again in every corner of the world where power sought to silence the human spirit. Suppression can work for a time through fear, through violence, through economic control and propaganda, but it always carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. When you attempt to dominate others, you teach them the language of resistance. When you strip them of freedom, you give them something to fight for that cannot be measured in territory or wealth. The longer the oppression continues, the deeper that determination grows. It transforms suffering into structure, pain into purpose, and despair into defiance. Every generation born under occupation inherits not submission, but memory, and memory is the one weapon that cannot be confiscated or bombed into silence. When we talk about power, we often imagine it as something static, as if the oppressor holds the permanent advantage. But power is fluid, and it shifts the moment the oppressed recognize that they have nothing left to lose. That realization changes the game completely. Those who once waited for mercy or justice from above begin to understand that they must define it themselves. And in doing so, they rewrite the rules that once confined them. The oppressor, who built an entire structure of dominance based on predictability and control, suddenly faces an adversary who does not play by the same logic. Every empire, every occupying force, every authoritarian regime has eventually faced this truth. Once the fear barrier is broken, no amount of force can restore it. In Yemen's confrontation with Israel, this truth reveals itself in real time. For years, Yemen has been seen as a nation crippled by war, famine, and poverty, yet it is precisely this suffering that has given rise to an unyielding will. When Israeli pilots were captured, it wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a symbolic one. It signified that the oppressed had taken the initiative, that they were no longer reacting but acting, setting the pace of conflict. For decades, Israel has relied on overwhelming power to maintain dominance, believing that deterrence would ensure compliance. But deterrence only works when the other side fears consequences more than it values resistance. Yemen's defiance proves that fear has lost its hold. The people who have already endured the worst that can be inflicted upon them cannot be subdued by threats. They have already lived beyond the limits that power assumed would keep them quiet. Occupation is never just military, it is psychological, economic, and cultural. It seeks to convince the oppressed that they are powerless, that their struggle is futile, that the system is eternal. It erases hope by rewriting history, by controlling narratives, by turning human beings into numbers and targets. But the paradox of oppression is that it cannot fully extinguish consciousness. The very act of suppressing truth gives it more clarity. The more the powerful try to silence dissent, the more visible it becomes. Words whispered in secret become movements shouted in the streets. Small acts of defiance turn into collective awakenings. Every bomb that falls, every act of injustice, becomes a reminder that submission only prolongs suffering. Eventually, people stop asking for permission to exist. They assert it. Redefining the terms of engagement means changing what victory and defeat even mean. For the powerful, victory is measured in control, in borders maintained, resources extracted, enemies subdued. For the oppressed, victory is existence itself. Every day that they survive, resist, and assert identity becomes a triumph. That difference in perspective is what makes suppression unsustainable. The oppressor must win endlessly to preserve dominance. The oppressed only need to endure to expose the illusion of superiority. When a movement survives against all odds, it reveals that control was never absolute. It reminds the world that the moral balance of history favors those who persist, not those who conquer. The dynamics of power often disguise this reality. The strong appear untouchable until the moment they are not. The fall of colonial empires, the collapse of apartheid, the uprisings that toppled dictators. None of these were sudden. They were the product of long, silent years of accumulation where every act of oppression added pressure to the system. The tipping point always comes quietly at first: a protest, a strike, a captured soldier, a moment that disrupts the rhythm of fear. Then the momentum shifts, and the powerful scramble to regain control of a narrative they no longer own. Israel's current shock mirrors this same historical trajectory. What was once unthinkable, that a small, war-torn country like Yemen could challenge it directly, becomes undeniable. The oppressed have once again redefined the field on which the conflict is fought. Economic systems also play a role in maintaining oppression. Control over trade, over resources, over the flow of information, all of it reinforces dependency. But even these systems cannot suppress human creativity forever. When external structures deny a people's right to thrive, they develop internal ones, they adapt, innovate, and create parallel economies of survival. In Yemen, despite years of blockade and devastation, communities have learned to sustain themselves through local means, through shared labor and ingenuity. That kind of autonomy frightens empires more than weapons do because it signals independence. It shows that control is slipping not just on the battlefield, but in the fabric of daily life. And once people learn they can live without their oppressors, they stop fearing them altogether. Cultural resistance is equally potent. Songs, stories, traditions, these are the vessels that carry defiance through generations. They remind people who they are when the oppressor tries to erase identity. The struggle ceases to be only political or military, it becomes existential. When a nation like Yemen reclaims its narrative, when it refuses to be defined by victimhood and instead frames itself as a symbol of resilience, the balance of legitimacy begins to shift. Israel's technological edge cannot compete with that kind of moral force. The world starts to see not just a conflict, but a contradiction between machinery and humanity, between domination and dignity. And once that perception spreads, the global narrative begins to realign. Those who are oppressed do not simply resist, they evolve. They learn from every loss, they adapt to every tactic, and they turn every defeat into a lesson. Oppression forces them to understand power more deeply than those who wield it. It teaches strategy, unity, patience. Over time, the oppressed become the most politically conscious actors in the world, while the oppressors become prisoners of their own arrogance. They confuse compliance with loyalty, control with stability, fear with respect. And when the moment of reckoning comes, they are always surprised, always shocked that the people they kept down have stood up. But for the oppressed, that moment is not surprise, it is destiny taking shape, the inevitable turning of history's wheel.